Is a sale of €50 worth of state-owned assets. However, there could be a solution in the wings that could get Greece out of Europe's clutches once and for all. Internationally renowned economist, former advisor to the IMF and author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, John Perkins joined me from Seattle. He says China's big banks are courting countries like Greece, who are sick of being bullied by the so-called hitmen of the IMF and EU. John Perkins, welcome to the program.
It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
If you could first explain, who are economic hitmen?
Well, I think it's fair to say that economic hitmen have really created the world's first truly global empire. It's not really so much a national empire as a corporate empire, although certainly a lot of countries are deeply involved in protecting it and enhancing it, like the United States, Germany right now in Europe. And we work many ways, but the most common one is to get a country deep into debt, which is what we're seeing in Greece now. But in the days when I was an economic hitman, these were mainly what we call the economically developing countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, where we would make huge loans to these countries to build big infrastructure projects. The money never actually went to the countries. It went to our own corporations to build power plants and industrial parks, things that would benefit a few wealthy families but not help the majority of the people. And in the end, the country would be left holding a huge debt they couldn't possibly repay. So at that point, they basically become our slaves, our serfs.
And is that the IMF and the EU?
Yes, it was, in my day, it was primarily the World Bank, and then the IMF would step in to rectify the problem, which meant privatizing things, implementing terrible austerity programs in these countries, like what we're seeing in Greece today. And in my day, it wasn't so much the EU, but now it's expanded. So you've got the World Bank, the IMF, the EU, the central banks of Europe, and the Troika.
The IMF is so intertwined with the Greek drama, but did it go in with the goals of effectively enslaving the country, or did it go in with more altruistic goals, which have then been derailed by corporations?
I think the corporations are driving this, but to a large degree it is about enslaving these countries. It's interesting that the IMF today issued a report that seemed to oppose what the Europeans are doing to a certain degree. I also find it very fascinating that Germany's debts were, half of them were forgiven after World War II, even though those debts had been incurred to kill millions of people. The debt, half of them were forgiven, and now Germany is taking this very hard stance with Greece. And it is, I think, about really making these countries be enslaved. It's about power. Maybe enslaved is too strong a word, but it's about control. It's about power. It's about controlling these economies.
There are countries, though, that have benefited from funding from the IMF. I mean, take Brazil, for example.
Well, Brazil's an interesting example because actually they stood up and refused to pay some of their loans at one point and then reached an accord with the financial institutions. Ecuador has done something very similar. The president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, said that his country didn't owe a large portion of its debts that they had been taken on by dictators, military dictators that had been installed by the CIA, and that was during the 70s, and I was actually involved in that on the side of the World Bank and I suppose the CIA. And Correa, who has a PhD in economics from a US university, refused to pay them. The IMF said, well, you've ruined your credit rating, you've defaulted, you've ruined your credit rating. China stepped in and gave Ecuador a pretty significant loan at low interest, and Ecuador has been paying the loan back and their credit rating has gone back up. Iceland did something similar, Argentina has done something, and as you mentioned, Brazil did something. And so I think when these countries really stand up to the financial institutions, if they stick to it, they end up coming out on top. And I'm concerned about Greece because it looks like the Greek government is crumbling, even though it appears that the Greek people don't want it to crumble.
Is that where Greece went wrong from the very beginning, in that they tried to right the wrongs and actually pay back what they owed to the IMF and the EU?
It's a tricky situation, I mean, let's face it, Greece made some bad mistakes. There was bad corruption. They took out too many loans. They overextended. You have to fault the Greeks to a certain degree. But then you have to ask yourself, well, once the mistakes have been made, what do you do to correct them? And these austerity programs are not the right measure. Even recently, the IMF has said that there has to be more debt forgiveness. They have to readjust the debt. And the Europeans don't seem to be willing to do this. I was extremely...
Did that surprise you that the IMF came out and did that?
It did, actually, and I was gratified to see it. And I think the motivation may have been the Chinese, because the Chinese stepped in Ecuador and in several other countries. And we now have these two very powerful banks that the Chinese have headed up, the BRICS Bank and also the AIID Bank that involves a lot of nations, including Europeans. So I have to suspect that Greece was looking, as Ecuador and other countries have, at perhaps defaulting on their loans to the Europeans and the Americans and the IMF, and instead going toward China. And of course, that's the last thing the Europeans and the Americans want to see happen. So I have a feeling that that may have played a role. I don't know that for sure, but that's my suspicion.
So is that a possible way that Greece could get out of this seemingly endless debt spiral?
I think that's a distinct possibility. If I were running the system in Greece right now, if I were the minister, the prime minister or the minister of finance, I'd be seriously looking at that alternative. I think that the Chinese are presenting a competitive edge here. So for a long time after the demise of the Soviet Union, the United States and the European Union as allies, and the banks that came out of those systems like the World Bank and the IMF, the Troika, had all the power. But now we're seeing a new competitive edge stepping in here, and in the form of the Chinese. And I actually think that's very healthy, and I think it's going to make the IMF and the World Bank modify their approaches to these things.
Is that why the US argued that countries like Australia should not be involved and should not support the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank?
Absolutely. The US certainly saw this as a threat, as competition, and it is. If you look at it that way, personally, I think it's extremely healthy, and I'm glad these banks are moving forward in that way. Competition's healthy in this business, because before you just had this one super banking industry that was controlling the planet, and now it's got competition, which is good.
So what hope do you have for countries like Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, which are in very similar situations to Greece? Do you think that they'll start to look to China to try and get out of their situations?
If I were in positions of power in any of those countries, I would definitely be looking at that. I think those countries probably gave a sigh of relief when the referendum happened in Greece, and the Greek people approved of standing up to the European. And now, though, that's turning around, and their government seems to be swinging against them and going in the opposite direction. So these countries that you mentioned, like Spain and Portugal and Italy and Ireland, have to really reassess all of this. But if I were them, I would definitely be talking to the Chinese.
So what's to stop the big banks out of China also acting like economic hitmen?
Well, ultimately, just good sense. There's nothing there to stop them, I don't think, except good sense. And I'll say this: I recently met with a minister of state of Ecuador, who's very savvy on these things, and he said, of course we'd rather borrow money from China. And I said, well, don't you think that China's going to turn around and do the same thing? He said, well, we have no idea ultimately what China will do, of course, but what we do know is that the World Bank, the IMF, the Europeans, and the US have screwed us over. And we also know that they've overthrown our governments in coups throughout Latin America. They've assassinated presidents down here, including in Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and I was involved in that situation. And they've put military bases around here. They've threatened us, and we resent that. China hasn't done that. And so right now, we trust China more than the United States. It remains to be seen what will happen. I would suspect that the Chinese are smart enough to have learned from the mistakes that the World Bank and the IMF and these other banks have made, and maybe not make those same mistakes, but only time will tell.
John Perkins, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
It's been my pleasure to talk with you.